just fill it
So
loosely.
just fill it, and then you can lightly, very lightly, just place your fingers in there. And the only reason we're doing that is you want to get the substrate off of the side of the lip. And then what we'll do is we'll take a dry towel and we'll go on that inside lip and we'll wipe that inside lip. And what that does, it gets the moisture off the inside of the jar. And a lot of people get contaminations because they don't do this. And when you dry this lip like I'm doing right here with this towel and dry it off and get all that moisture off that lip, you got a nice clean.
Right.
Nice.
So contaminants won't be able to colonize
Yeah,
down that
the
layer.
contaminants won't be able to go down the side of the jar and in.
So what are you going to top it off with?
And so what I'm going to do now, I got some dry vermiculite, and we're just going to very lightly put it in here. Then you just sort of tap it slightly, not hard.
So you're just leveling it off. You're not pushing down at all.
Right. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the jar lid, which has 4 holes punched in it, and the holes are punched in it for your inoculation points. And you're going to put the lid over the top.
And I see you use rubber side up.
And what you do, you can either use masking tape and put over the holes, or you can use microspore tape like this and put that on.
The micropore tape is the medical tape.
It's a medical tape.
As we watch Jim fill the rest of these jars, note that he puts the substrate in the jars very loose and airy. Then he wipes down the top ½ inch, 1 centimeter of the jar in order to clean the substrate off the side of the jar. Then puts the dry vermiculite in, followed by the lid rubber side up. The only purpose for putting it rubber side up is it just makes it easier to get off later. And then you cover the inoculation and gas exchange holes with micropore tape.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and put the aluminum foil onto the jars now. I pre-formed them.
Yeah, we can use that same foil over and over again.
Yeah, you can use it over and over again.
You got them wrapped. Here's your pan.
And
I see we have a layer of jar lids in the bottom.
I'm putting jar lids in the bottom, and what that does, it will keep the jars from being on the bottom of the pot. You know, on one of the sites that I teach on, a lot of people put a dish towel or a towel in the bottom, and then they'll put water in there and then put their jars on top of the dish towel, and it's just not a real good method, because sometimes if you put the jars in the bottom of your pot, it'll crack the bottoms, or else it'll burn the substrate in the bottom of the jar.
From the intense heat
Exactly.
of the burner.
Right. And I'm going to put another layer of jar lids in.
So we're going to have our jars actually
And our jars
2 or
are gonna
3
be-
centimeters off the bottom.
They're going to be off the bottom, and it's also going to keep them out of the water.
Right.
So now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and put some water in.
Okay. Well, I've got a pitcher of water right here. Now, how much water are you going to use?
I am going to just bring it, I'm going to put enough water in here so it just comes up to the top jar ring.
The important thing to remember here is the jars are completely out of the water, and that's a really good idea. The steam is going to sterilize them because we'll have a fairly tight-fitting lid. So get imaginative, use whatever you have around the house. We used extra jar lids because most mushroom growers have an abundance of jars anyway. If you have a vegetable steamer, I've seen people use a layer of rocks, several layers of aluminum foil, just whatever you have, but try to elevate your jars completely out of the water, and that will prevent the water when it boils from splashing up under the foil and then dripping down through your holes and ruining the moisture content of your substrate. We're going to put this kettle on the stove now and turn the stove up on high and bring the water to a full boil. Once it boils, go ahead and reduce the stove setting because otherwise it'll just boil your kettle dry. But you want to reduce the stove setting just to the minimum point that will keep the water boiling, and the steam itself is going to sterilize the jars. Let your water boil for 90 minutes, and during that 90 minutes, if you need to add a little bit of water, go ahead and do so. But don't start counting the 90 minutes until the water actually reaches a full boil. Some growers prefer to use 60 minutes. We found that 90 minutes gives you a really good sterilization, so I'd recommend going with that. You're going to see in this next section that a glove box does not need to be fancy at all. Jim is going to be inoculating these jars with my glove box, which is nothing more than a plastic storage tote with holes cut in it for your arms to go through. And he'll be wearing latex gloves. I also gave him a couple of Tyvek wrist sleeves to use because those are really effective in helping to seal the gap around the holes, which stops the drafts from getting in, and it also prevents any dead skin cells or whatnot from flaking off of his arms and getting into the work. Let's watch. It's extremely important to flame sterilize the needle on your syringe prior to the first inoculation, and then to prevent cross-contamination, you want to flame sterilize it again in between each and every jar. The funny thing is, this day with all these bright studio lights we had set up, Jim couldn't even see that the flame was lit, and in fact he's looking over at it going, "Hey, is that thing lit?" After flame sterilizing, you only need to let the needle cool for a second or two, and then you can go ahead and use it. The first drop of solution is going to cool the needle anyway, and then the rest can flow contaminant-free. Notice how Jim is holding it at an angle, and he's shooting the syringe right towards the glass at the edge of the jar. This way you can see the inoculant enter, and also as it starts to colonize, you'll see right away if you have healthy mycelium or a contaminant. So it's always a good idea to inoculate towards the edges rather than in the center of your jar. And this exact process will be repeated for each of the other 4 jars. Jim will flame sterilize between the jars. There's no reason to flame between holes of the same jar, but don't forget to flame sterilize between each and every jar. This prevents cross-contamination. The next step, as you can see, is to put your jars on a shelf and allow them to colonize. They'll do fine at normal room temperature. If you can keep them just a little bit warmer, they'll colonize faster. About 75 to 81 Fahrenheit is perfect. That's about 24 to 28 Celsius. And as you can see here, about 5 days later, if you use liquid culture, the mycelium will be growing out. If you use spores, it takes a little bit longer, but this is what you're going to see initially. The last picture we saw was what it looks like when everything goes as planned. In this picture, you see what it looks like when things go not as planned. This is trichoderma, the forest green mold, and it's the bane of mushroom cultivators everywhere. You're going to learn to hate it. There's no saving these jars. When you see this, you have to toss them out. If you need to save the glass jar itself, you need to throw it into some boiling water for about an hour to kill the mold before you open it up, because if you open these jars up in your house to dump them out, you're going to spread those green spores everywhere. They're very sticky. They'll stick to you, your clothes, your hair, and then you'll carry them into your grow area, and that will simply ruin your future projects. So when you see the green mold like this, the answer is to toss it out. Boil the jars in water for an hour, dump them down the drain, and start over. Better luck next time. Here's an example of a jar at 90% colonization, and the next picture is a jar at 100% colonization. This is oyster mycelium, and these are the exact jars that Jim inoculated earlier in this segment in our glove box. Other species that you might grow, such as Psilocybe cubensis, are going to be much ropier. They produce a rhizomorphic mycelium as opposed to the linear or cottony mycelium of the oyster mycelium you see here. But either way, before you take it to the next step, what you want is full colonization where the entire jar is white. You don't want to see any uncolonized parts at all before you go to this next step. In this next section, we'll be building a small terrarium to put our cakes in, and the idea is very simple. All we need is an enclosed area that'll hold a high humidity and still allow plenty of fresh air. Let's watch. The next step after getting our terrarium built is to put some perlite in it. Perlite is an excellent means of humidifying a terrarium. It works by having a very, very large surface area. It's a crystalline product, so water doesn't absorb into it. But because it has such a large surface area, water coats the outer surface of it, And then when we put it into our terrarium over a period of weeks, that water evaporates back off again and it fills up our terrarium with humidity. It's really, really great. And it's a long proven method that works very well. Here's a picture of an individual piece of perlite. This piece is only about maybe a 1/16 of an inch in diameter, about 1 millimeter. And you can see from looking at it that it's just full of nooks and crannies and little bumps. So it has a very large surface area. And that is how it works for humidification, because the water coats the entire surface and then over time it is able to evaporate off. Now you can see from this next picture, this is a stack of perlite. It's only a small, maybe a tablespoon's worth, that I put under the microscope and zoomed it all the way out so that I could show you what it looks like in your terrarium. So you can see there's a tremendous amount of surface area, and with this surface area being coated with the water, it then evaporates out and is sufficient to humidify your entire terrarium for well over a month without adding water. You want to spread the perlite out, and you want to make it about 4 to 5 inches deep or so. As you can see, it's about the depth that my hand is if it's turned on its side. Don't pack it down. You want it nice and loose and fluffy and airy so that you've got the maximum amount of surface area exposed, so it can do its job evaporating. And here's what it looks like when you get it full of cakes. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I want to show you a part that I filmed earlier with a different terrarium, and it's what we call birthing and the dunk and roll tech. I like to give at least 1 or 2 cakes out of each batch a good sniff after birthing, just to make sure it has that nice, fresh, mushroomy smell. Well, as you can see, birthing is a pretty simple process. I like to take the vermiculite barrier off. Some people go ahead and save it and use it over again, but the way I look at it, it's been exposed to the elements, and that's been our filter. So let's go ahead and scrape that off. Vermiculite's cheap. We'll use more later. But scrape the vermiculite barrier off and then just slam your jar down on a piece of wood, and you'll find the cake will just pop right out usually. And then I like to rinse it under the faucet before I begin the soak. You get most of that vermiculite off and just give it a good rinse, and then we're going to put it in water and weight it down and soak it for 24 hours. Well, this is the roll part of the dunk and roll. After the 24-hour soak, we're going to take our cakes out, rinse them well under water to clear off any bacteria or whatever that may have grown on the surface. And then we're going to roll them very well in dry vermiculite. And rolling is just about like what you would do with a piece of chicken when you put flour on it. You want to just put it into the dry verm and throw it all over it and coat the cake really well and then set it into your terrarium. Now, vermiculite's a mineral, so it doesn't really harbor any kind of contaminants, but you never know what might have landed on it. So before you roll your cakes in it, it's probably a good idea to put it on a cookie sheet, and you can just stick it in the oven on about 350 or so for half an hour, and that should be sufficient to kill off any mold spores that may have just landed on it. Now, after the dunk and roll, I like to let the cakes sit in the terrarium for about a half an hour or so, and then open it up and take your mister, and you want to wet that vermiculite very, very well. We use it dry. When we roll it on, it sticks to the cake much better if it's dry. And if you try to mist it right away, you'll end up washing the vermiculite off. But if you let it sit for half an hour, you can then come back with your mister, and you want to do this several times over about the next 2 hours and really get that vermiculite nice and moist, because this is going to serve as a moisture reservoir and also as a casing layer for your cakes, and it really does improve the performance. Now, bear in mind, these pictures were only taken 4 days after the birth and dunk and roll. It's real important at full colonization that you allow your cakes to have 1 full week after they are fully colonized. And the reason for that is once they're colonized, you need to give the mycelium time to consolidate its hold on the substrate. They're not going to fruit for a week. Even if you birth them right at full colonization, they're just going to sit for a week anyway, so it's better to give them that time in the jar for the mycelium to consolidate its hold on the substrate. Now, these are the cakes that Jim inoculated. The syringes were made up with my isolated oyster strain that was cloned in the mountains, and when you look at the cloning tech in this video, you'll see the exact cluster that these were cloned from. Now, this next picture is 72 hours later, so these are 7 days after birthing, and they're just about ready for harvest. This is just about the perfect stage for picking. These pictures were sent in by Fatster, and this is a beautiful flush here. All of these cakes are in a small terrarium just like the one we made. And this second picture is the same set of cakes about 3 days later. And this picture is one of Fatster's cakes from the terrarium removed. You can see here these cakes are double stacked. What Fatster does is he takes 2 of these half-pint cakes and stacks one on top of the other, and then puts a layer of vermiculite on top of those that he can then pour water into to keep them hydrated. The secret to growing a lot of mushrooms and to getting good size on your mushrooms is making sure that you're able to give them plenty of water, so remember that. Well, coming back to some of my own pictures now, this is Hericium, the lion's mane mushroom, and this is another excellent candidate for growing on these cakes. As you can see, the one that found an opening and grew out through it looks much better than the ones on the inside. The Hericium is very much CO2 intolerant, and after this mushroom grew out and looked so pretty on the outside, I started leaving the lid completely off of the terrarium, and the rest of the ones inside recovered and started looking very well too. So if you do decide to grow the lion's mane by this method, leave the lid completely off of your terrarium and then just mist a time or 2 a day and they will thrive. Now finally, in closing, I'd like to leave you with one of my favorite mushrooms. This is the shiitake mushroom. It's very tasty as well as one of the most powerful anti-cancer foods you can eat. They grow very well on brown rice flour cakes. The only difference that I use is I substitute sawdust for the vermiculite in the mix. Everything else remains the same. We're going to use 1 cup of water, 1 cup of brown rice flour, and 2 cups of sawdust. Now at the end of your colonization, when your jar is fully colonized, allow it to sit for at least 2 weeks after that point. This allows your mycelium to digest the food that it has just colonized. We call this consolidation. At the end of that consolidation period, go ahead and burr the cakes and wash them under the faucet very well. You want to remove as much of the vermiculite contamination barrier that you put in place as what will readily wash off. And then soak your cakes overnight in water, then stick them right back in the jar and place into a terrarium for fruiting. Now you'll notice from these pictures that the mushrooms themselves are forming at the glass cake interface where the humidity is real high, and then they climb out looking for air. So that's an advantage. When I used to burr the cakes directly into the terrarium, they'd sit there for a long time and not fruit, or they'd make very small mushrooms. Leaving them in the jar like this works much better. In addition, when you leave them in the jar, about once every 4 or 5 days, you can run some water into the jar. I like to fill the jar all the way up and then let the cake sit in the water for about 3 or 4 hours. This rehydrates it. You'll notice anytime you're growing rather large mushrooms on a small substrate, they just suck all the moisture out. The leading cause of small mushrooms with these cakes, regardless of species, is running out of water. So by having them in the jar like this, you can essentially soak them every 4 or 5 days and keep them fully hydrated, so you'll get nice, luscious, juicy mushrooms. Also, I'd like to point out, in addition to the information contained in this video and some of the excellent books on the subject, there's also some very good online mushroom forums where you can go to and read up. People will share their pictures and their information and techniques, and you can also ask questions and get them answered. One of the best is shroomery.org. So visit there, scroll through the posts, look at the pictures, and feel free to ask and have your questions answered for you. Happy mushrooming!